The United States has, in the past, had some hotly contested elections, but only in a few of them did the political temperature run as high as the election of 1876, which saw the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, victorious and sworn in as president, whereas Samuel J. Tilden, his opponent, had won the popular vote as well as the Electoral College, until he hadn't. At this time, anger and resentment at former Civil War opponents was commonplace across the United States, and as the nature of this election's results became clear and how quickly they then changed, many Americans feared that both Hayes and Tilden would simultaneously have themselves inaugurated as president, acts which would then obviously bring the country to the brink of another civil war. But how justified were these fears? How close was the United States to another civil war in the wake of the election of 1876? So as you'll know, the American Civil War ended in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy and the end of slavery as an institution. And after this, the victorious US government had the difficult task of reincorporating the defeated states back into the Union. This was done via a process known as Reconstruction, which was neither popular nor successful. Reconstruction saw the Confederacy divided into occupation zones and run by military governors from the Union. All slaves within them were freed, and the federal government granted itself much greater authority and power to act within those states. For a state to end this status and rejoin the United States properly, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which gave everyone born within the US American citizenship and granted them all equal rights under the law. At least in theory. In practice, no. Once they had ratified the 14th Amendment, these southern states were readmitted. 5 seconds after this, many of them passed laws which restricted the rights of black citizens, heavily suppressed their ability to vote, and also turned a blind eye to violence against them. You'd think that this would be a violation of their terms of readmission, which would then come with some consequences, but sad fact, no. The reason that they got away with this was that officially these things weren't done on the basis of race, but instead were based upon things like property ownership and literacy, which were only very heavily correlated with race, which is technically different. Over the next decade, things only got more heated, which brings us to the 1876 election. This came at the end of Ulysses S. Grant's second term as president, who at this point was unpopular due to numerous corruption scandals as well as being seen as out of touch with the average American. Knowledge of this led to the Republicans nominating the more moderate Rutherford B. Hayes, who wanted reconciliation with the South, whereas the Democrats chose Samuel J. Tilden, whose being the governor of New York was hoped could swing the state away from the Republicans, and his economic policies were well liked in the South, many of whose white residents just wanted the Republicans out of office and the end of Reconstruction. The election was a close one, and because information travelled somewhat slowly, each party was mostly working with estimates. The next day, the Democrats proclaimed that Tilden had won the popular vote as well as all of these states, thereby giving him 203 electoral votes, well over the 185 he needed to win. However, the Republicans claimed that in fact Hayes had actually won all of these states, and the only one which was too close to call was Florida, thereby giving Hayes 181 electoral votes to Tilden's 184, with Florida's 4 votes still in play. It won't surprise you to learn that after this things became quite tense because there were some irregularities that occurred in these 3 states during the vote. In both Louisiana and Florida, violence and fraud had been a big issue. You see, unlike the modern day, there wasn't any standardization of ballots or methods of voting, and in these 2 states, votes were often cast by posting pre-printed party ballots, and the ballots used by the Democrats had been intentionally designed to look like Republican ones, which was believed to have tricked some illiterate voters, i.e. many of them, into voting for the wrong party. Whereas South Carolina had managed the impressive feat of casting more votes than the stated eligible voters. As such, the still in charge but probably not for much longer Republican-run state governments within these states quickly removed the votes that they considered ineligible, i.e. the ones for the Democrats, and Hayes was soon given these 3 states and therefore the presidency. Obviously, this swift change was going to cause some resentment amongst the people, hence why the president-elect was soon given the nickname Rutherford B. Hayes by his opponent. Now normally it would fall to the vice president as head of the Senate to certify the election, but 1, he was too busy being dead, and 2, the man who had replaced him as head of the Senate was a Republican and no Democrat would accept his verdict. Furthermore, the Democrats argued that as the party in control of the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment, it was up to them to choose the next president, which of course the Republicans were not okay with. Things were looking pretty bad, but guess what though, the 1876 election wasn't done. You see, Tilden wasn't a dummy, and he and his team knew that the Republicans would argue that the federal government had no jurisdiction to override the changed results that the state returned for the election. And so the Democrats got the governor of Oregon, an ally of Tilden, to replace one of the Republican Electoral College voters with the Democrat, who then voted for Tilden even though Oregon had swung for Hayes, thereby giving him 1 vote that he needed for victory. It was at this point that people started to get really angry and talk of a civil war began in earnest. The incumbent President Grant ordered thousands of troops to take up positions in and around Washington, D.C. to protect Hayes during the transition of power. Hayes' swearing-in ceremony was also secretly moved forward by a day and privately into the White House. And furthermore, Democrats were also banned from the later public ceremony to prevent any potential incidents. Whereas on Tilden's behalf, numerous governors offered to call up state militias to fight for Tilden's presidency. And these divides weren't simply across previous Confederate Union lines either. Union General George B. McClellan was gathering soldiers and veteran societies and speaking to former Confederate leaders in case armed conflict should break out. And some of Tilden's supporters also planned to set up their own inauguration in New York to challenge Hayes. At this point, many Americans were now terrified of another civil war and what they called the Mexicanization of American politics. And so, fearing another conflict, or at the very least mass civil disobedience, it was decided in the most Washington-esque move ever that this crisis would be solved by a commission. Said commission would have 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, 3 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and 2 from the Supreme Court. And it would also have 1 non-partisan Supreme Court judge who would ultimately be the tiebreaker. And both parties did the unthinkable and they agreed on something. They agreed that said member would be Justice David Davis because he was seen as a fundamentally honourable man. But it was here that the Democrats had a fantastic idea. Let's win him over to our side by offering to make him a senator. A position which he accepted, but because he was said honourable man, he felt that this would sway his vote and so he resigned the commission. He was then replaced with another justice, this time a Republican because all of the remaining justices were, and after a series of partisan votes, Hayes won the election with 185 Electoral College votes to Tilden's 184. Importantly, it had been agreed beforehand that this commission's decision would be final. Unless, of course, both halves of Congress rejected it, but since only the House did, President Hayes it was. This decision looked like it could split the country, but it was here that Tilden accepted defeat. Not because he recognised that he lost the election, but because most of his fellow Democrats weren't willing to cross certain lines. He'd also done a terrible job of pushing his claim. You see, Tilden was, to use a technical term, loaded, and when his allies asked him to finance their preparations, he refused and instead kept quiet and basically waited to see if he would just be made president. Whereas Hayes did not do this, and he was very clear that he had won and was going to be the next president, and anybody who disagreed was anti-democratic and probably smelled bad too. Tilden only became forceful after the commission had declared for Hayes, at which point it was too late because his backers had mostly calmed down. At least enough to put the guns away. Because whilst many Democrats and Southerners were angry with the outcome, they knew that another civil war was too awful to comprehend. Furthermore, given the slim majority that Republicans had won by and given that many Democrats saw Tilden as a weak candidate, they didn't feel the need to push too hard. Because they knew that they'd be guaranteed to win the next one. Spoiler alert, they did not. Now, there's a commonly held belief that says an informal agreement was made between the Democrats and the Republicans, known by some as the corrupt bargain of 1877, wherein the Democrats gave Hayes the presidency in return for him ending Reconstruction and withdrawing federal troops from the South. Now, he actually did do these things, but there's zero evidence of such an agreement ever being made. Now, of course, none of them would have actually written this down. It's just simply the case that Hayes was a much more moderate Republican, and he believed that Grant and his party had been far too harsh on the former Confederacy. Also, had this deal existed, then the House of Representatives almost certainly wouldn't have continually refused to acknowledge Hayes' presidency. It even went so far as to pass a bill stating that Tilden was the actual winner of the 1876 election and that Hayes' presidency was illegitimate. Realistically, of course, this didn't do anything except for make them feel better about the situation, but either way, the election was over. And so, civil war, whilst closer than many would have imagined, was made more likely due to a lack of process for a contested election. But it was ultimately prevented by the culture of democracy that the vast majority of Americans and their representatives held dear. Whilst of course people were extremely angry, the vast majority of politicians on both sides recognised the horrors of the Civil War could never be revisited, and that for the sake of themselves in the United States, maintaining a stable form of government trumped all else. Cooler heads had prevailed. I hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle, Katoitska, YN Hockey, Anthony Beckett, Marvin Kassow, Winston Kaywood, Gustav Swan, Captain Psydog, Andy McGeehee, Alex Schwinn, Copper Tone, Robert C. Perkins, Mirza Ahmed, AF Firefly, Spencer Lightfoot, Castle Bravo, Rod D. Martin, Respectable Level of Chaos, Spinning 3 Plates, Arthur Hosey Jr., Yuduan Wang, Shuenin, Kamoon Yoon, The McWhopper, Michael Holbert, The Jim Stannon, Kalitro, The Flying Deutschland, Starry Nights, Bonnie Bounds, Jim Strumberg, Remco Huisman, Betkabot, Lord Beak, and Charles I.